Thank you very much for this very informative paper. I think we learned a lot. Now I suggest that the first question are addressed to Professor Jayal, and later on we come back to the general discussion. So.
Thanks, that was a fantastic presentation, very illuminating. And I've been trying to define the takeaway for myself, and I'll just, as a prelude, note that religious nationalism seemed to be on the rise today, after a long period of slumber. And you could, not just in India, obviously, but across the globe. I mean, you can point to a whole, we're aware of that happening in another number of Muslim settings, but it's also been happening in Sri Lanka, Buddhism, Israel, okay? So settings that previously were defined in more secular terms are now shifting politically. Hungary, all right? So it doesn't seem to be restricted to any one religious tradition, but can be found throughout them all. So I'm wondering, is it, you know, are there any mechanisms or sort of ways of defining dynamics that within the Indian setting that would be applicable to other settings, right? Now, for instance, I wrote down, this is just one little summary for myself. Religious differences become politically significant, often and perhaps mainly for non-religious reasons. All right, so we're tempted when dealing with Muslim settings, for example, to say, oh, it's the religion that requires this. That's why it's happening. They're just reverting to form, to ancient form. They have to do it. But if your analysis is correct and could be applied to other settings, the religious differences only become politically relevant for certain reasons. And so if I don't know, is there any way just to sum up a few, at least one dynamic that you think would be applicable in to other settings, so we could yeah.
I mean, I think it's a sort of, it's a well-known idea in social science that the explanation for any kind of ethnic conflict, including religious nationalism, would, that there's a constructivist explanation for it, that when politicians find it useful to construct such differences and mobilize people along those lines is when, but I mean, there are sort of arguments in the last few years we've heard a lot about the age of anger, right? We've also heard that there are multiple reasons why people are disenchanted with the circumstances of their lives. Some of these have to do with globalization. Others have to do, for instance, the Indian case, perhaps to do with, certain sort of types of sort of economic growth which has disadvantaged some, or which some people feel they are left out of and have not yet been able to participate in fully as much as they would have liked to. It could be to do with, deepening inequalities. So there would be sort of multiple factors. So constructivism can explain specifics in particular countries contextually, but there obviously have to be triggering factors as well as to when constructivism succeeds, when politicians' efforts to mobilize people along particular ethnic lines actually succeed and when they don't. And on that, I don't think that there's any sort of general rule, at least I'm not aware of it.
Professor Hösle.
Thank you very much, Professor Jayal, for the splendid analysis. I would like to continue the line of questioning of Professor Reichberg when you spoke about the vigilantes hunting down people of religious minority. I had to think we are here in Rome, and you may have heard that in Rome there is a so-called Casa Ezra Pound, named after the famous American fascist poet. And the members of the Casa Ezra Pound are dedicated to hunting down illegal migrants here in Italy and to beat them up. That is their job. Yesterday, 2 of them were arrested because they were raping a woman. That was part of their self-understanding of vigilantes protection of the Occidental values. So I think Gregory is completely right. It's a general pattern. And I'm afraid the mechanism is relatively simple, even if repellent human mechanism. In Germany, we call it the Radfahrer mechanism, the mechanism of the cyclist to bow towards upper powers in order to tread on people beneath you. The more frustration builds up in certain people, in certain social structures, the more they have need to show their superiority to people who are weaker than them, and they are usually people from minorities. So we see this as a anthropologically, unfortunately, rooted phenomenon, and it spreads clearly, it has spread in the last years for various reasons. I think myself, the main reason is the decline of the worker class, that the incapacity of maintaining their self-respect in a quickly changing economy, because one fact is obvious. In the 19th century, Marx believed that the workers would be the class of the future. Well, the peasants have been the basic class of humanity for probably 5,000 years. The class of the workers will maximum determine the human economy for 200 years. They will be replaced by machines to a large amount. And all this builds up an enormous frustration, insecurity that finds outlets in this form, and there are politicians who have a nose that if they appeal to this wrath, to this hatred, they can get themselves into a power position. And that is, I think, what we are witnessing worldwide. Although I come from the United States, the Trump phenomenon is not very different when he says the fact that I did not get the popular vote but only the vote in the Electoral College is due that people who are illegal migrants who entered our country voted against me. And he will repeat it if he's not re-elected next year. You can be sure about that. And this may lead to a serious constitutional crisis in the United States. So the phenomenon is general. My question is simply, since you speak about India, and part of this conference is to try to understand the general phenomenon and the differences. And forgive me if I ask you this question very frankly as a person who has studied Sanskrit up to the PhD and admire profoundly the Indian culture, and for whom Mahatma Gandhi is one of a great beacon of humankind, one of the saints that humanity has produced. Do you think that in India, the rise of the BJP can be explained as a reaction to the fact that the Indian constitution was to a large amount something that reflected British values, insofar as it reflected some form of egalitarianism, even if Mahatma Gandhi, of course, brought about Indian independence. He was a lawyer trained in British law, and he had deeply imbibed Western values. While if you accept, for example, Dumont's famous book on Homo hierarchicus as something profoundly rooted in the Indian caste system, one could come to the conclusion that many of the values that had dominated India in the first decades were only a Western imposition. I remember when I lived in your country many years ago, in '92, there was, I don't know if it's still much used, the term of Shuddhi, purification. You have to Shuddhi, the purification of India. And the purification was, of course, mainly elimination of Muslims from India, but also deleterious Western influence on our own culture. We have to get the country purified from them. And so my question is, do you think that this plays a role in the phenomenon, that this is a specific Indian part of the problem, or that it's simply the general phenomenon that we see worldwide?
Those are a lot of questions. So first of all, Gandhi had very little to do with the Constitution, absolutely nothing. He was not part of the Constituent Assembly. In fact, he was not, he wanted a sort of more decentralized system, starting with village republics, so he was not, but the fact that, I don't know if I would say that there were British values reflected in the Constitution. of course, 75% of the Indian constitution is taken from the Government of India Act of 1935, which was a British legislation. But the parts that contain the fundamental rights and the sort of spirit of the Constitution, the non-institutional part, is what was enacted, what was drafted by the Constituent Assembly under the leadership of Dr. B.R. Ambedkar and Jawaharlal Nehru. Now, you could say that, I mean, if at all one is inclined to reference any particular school of political thinking, it would be broadly Fabian socialism, and liberalism and Fabian socialism, which you might say were values that inflected the Constitution. But these values, I think we need to remember, were forged in the practice of the national movement led by the Indian National Congress, by Gandhi, but by a whole constellation of other leaders as well. So, the emphasis, for instance, on economic justice is something that comes back from the early 1930s. Late 20s and early 30s. And so, yes, so that's a complex question. But to return, I don't know, I didn't quite get what you said about the purification. Where did you encounter this in 1992? In the destruction of the Barbari Masjid?
For example.
In that? Okay, yeah.
I mean, in 92, the BJP begins to rise to national
BJP,
prominence.
exactly.
It was the beginning of a phenomenon. And I met some BJP politicians in India, and their central idea was, we have had too much Western exposition to Western ideas. They want to impose their model on us, and particularly the occupation by Muslims has been deleterious for our own tradition. We have to regain that and react against that. Right. That was the idea that they were spreading.
Yeah. No, you're absolutely right about that. So the BJP went from having 2 seats in parliament at the time to, what it has become today over these years. And the destruction of the Babri Masjid was a defining moment in the history of the BJP. What the BJP has done effectively is to, in its first phase, ruling from the late 90s under the leadership of Atal Bihari Vajpayee, who was the first BJP prime minister, it was to make it respectable to articulate anti-minority sentiments in polite company. Before that, it was unthinkable. Today, this is more widespread, and it does have something to do with factors that you mentioned, which are specific to Europe. It also has something there is a resonance of that problem in India as well, which is that we have a very large young population. The demographic shift that has occurred in the last few years, I think we're looking at, in 2030 or some such, we're looking at 65% of the population being below 35. There is not enough, there aren't enough educational opportunities or employment opportunities for these young people. Young people are available on hire by political parties who pay them to go out, and whether it's vigilante violence or simply getting on a motorcycle, brandishing a flag aggressively and going through a Muslim neighborhood, sort of keeping the pot boiling or simmering, let's say, keeping the communal pot simmering in the countryside. That's something that, it's just you basically intimidate people by your very presence, by the use of certain symbols and so on. So, yes, there is this, what Marx would have called the reserve army of the unemployed, is, you have this reserve army available to you of young people who have not benefited from the economic reforms themselves, who are underemployed or unemployed and undereducated or not educated in any useful way, being available to parties and forces like this, which does obviously, taps into their frustrations and can mobilize them quite easily. So that element is also there. Yeah.
Thank you. Professor Suarez-Orozco.
Thank you so much, Professor Jayal, for that exceedingly clear presentation. I'm grateful to you for everything you have shared with us. It is indeed the case that India is heretofore the largest multicultural, plural democracy the world has ever seen. Every 7th person in the world lives in a multicultural Indian democracy up to now. On the killing of the cow killers, I'm reminded of an anthropological idea to end cannibalism by eating the cannibals. So my proper question really is, first, if Moody didn't have the Muslims, he would have to invent them. But I wonder if you could comment on something that Vittorio alluded to, and that is the cultural logic of purity and pollution. Atavistically, a term you use at the beginning of your dissertation, the atavistic return of this very central idea, in my very, very ignorant understanding of India, really at the center of the scheduled classes, castes concept. So I wonder if you could reflect on that. Purity and pollution as a new organizing idea in the thalamic brain, in the reptilian brain, in the hypothalamus, the centers of fear and aggression.
You know, I'd say historically, traditionally, that was important, but we all know, and this we've known for some time now, that lots of, not just political scientists, but also sociologists have told us that caste is today more politically salient than socially salient. So it's not the daily practice of purity and pollution is not what it might have been when Dumont was writing, or, and perhaps not even then to that extent. Today it is politically salient, partly because of a history which goes back to the 1980s, actually, to the mid-1980s, when you had the emergence of a bunch of parties which were trying to advance the claims of a group of castes which are basically middle castes. They are not the scheduled castes. So there's the pollution angle doesn't come in there at all. They're not, they would not even historically or traditionally at any point in Indian history have been considered polluting castes, but they are not they're not upper castes, so they're sort of middle castes. And these castes began to mobilize politically. So there's a political economy of land issue as well there, which I won't go into, but these castes mobilized politically and became extremely important. Many of them still, many of these political parties, there was one initially and then it fragmented into 3 or 4. In North India, these are extremely powerful political parties even today, and they have a lot of resonance. But caste, in that sense, is politically salient. It's not socially relevant in the same way as it might have been. And certainly, this kind of caste politics has very little to do with purity and pollution. In fact, we're currently witnessing in North India, in the course of this election, the coming together of a party which has claimed to represent the scheduled castes for the last few decades, in partnership with one of these parties. So I don't think that purity and pollution is today a relevant principle at all. Even the BJP, in its rhetoric, tries to reach out to the Dalit castes, but only rhetorically. It appropriates Ambedkar as a symbol and so on, but it looks the other way when there's vigilante violence against Dalits. So, yeah, I don't think purity and pollution is a defining feature anymore. Yeah.
Professor Matlari?
Thank you for an excellent presentation and quite frightening in terms of its content. And one wonders whether there isn't, why there is impunity for this kind of violence in a democracy. I wanted to point out one thing, namely political theories of representation and democracy that take into account permanent minorities. Ronald Inglehart, the Dutch political scientist, has developed this for the Netherlands, where there are, in a way, permanent minorities which can never achieve a majority, and therefore they must be, in a way, weighed in the system. So you have like pillars, and then you have a consensual structure on top of it. So this seems to be one type of representative system that could be relevant, because majority tyranny is one well-known problem, and also minority tyranny in some places, that you have permanent minorities that never get around to partaking in the majority. And my question is, in a way, is this relevant in Indian debate? And also minority rights that are well developed, particularly in the OSCE, which is then a European organization basically, but also in human rights, that minorities have rights. Because it seems to me it's very odd that you have a democracy with these kinds of terrible problems for minorities, that there isn't, in a way, how can it be democratic when it is so suppressive? Thank you.
To clarify, that the Constitution gives minorities full rights. I think I mentioned that, when I was trying to describe the complexity of India's diversity. So the Constitution certainly guarantees rights for minorities, and if I have overstated the dangers, that overstatement applies more to the very recent past than to the sort of institutional and constitutional structure per se, where minorities do in fact have rights. We do not have a system like the one you mentioned in the Netherlands, but up until now, it has always been an article of faith with all political parties that to try and have a fair representation both in Parliament and in the Cabinet and in other institutions, to have a fair representation of minorities. So you would typically, we've had Muslim presidents of the Republic, and we've had, always the Cabinet, even Modi's Cabinet had a couple of ministers who were Muslims, but they were from the upper house, they're not popularly elected. So that has always been something that has been, even if purely symbolic, but it has always been done. It is this government for the first time that is undercutting that practice. So it's been there in practice, and rights are guaranteed in the Constitution and in the law. A range of rights for religious minorities are guaranteed. So it's not that those rights aren't there. It's just that the current practices lead one to worry about actual respect for those rights and the ability of people whose rights are violated to be able to go to court to be able to enforce their claims. So those are the worries that are, it's the shakiness of that and the worry about impunity that we have today. In the constitutional structure, those rights remain. Yeah.
Professor Carrozza?
Well, first of all, like all my colleagues, I was absolutely fascinated by the presentation. Thank you so much. One of the things that I found most provocative was not simply the narrative of the rise of this religious nationalism that is quite disturbing, but the fact that you begin that story essentially saying that it has eclipsed a different kind of nationalism, like a civic nationalism. And so part of my curiosity is, what happened to that? Why did civic nationalism collapse, and what has happened to it? Was it weak because it was never really sustained or never really believed in, or what allowed it to be so quickly replaced and dissipated? And related to that, a second question is your reference to the institutional constitutional system makes me wonder, and I think it's useful for our reflection more broadly in these days. What is the effectiveness of institutional constraints on these sorts of things? I mean, as a lawyer, like you, as a jurist, I'm a huge admirer for decades of the Indian Supreme Court. Where has the Indian Supreme Court been in this, which has a history of, at least an older history that I'm familiar with, of protecting the secular state and the neutrality of the secular state. So it makes me wonder how we should judge the effectiveness or not of institutional systems against these sorts of developments. This one was about the fate of civic nationalism.
Right. I'm tempted to say that we should wait till May the 23rd to decide whether civic nationalism has been junked forever or not. That's the date when the election results are due. But to go back to something Vittorio said about Donald Trump, the outgoing government in India today also was elected. The popular mandate was just 31%. So if one assumes that the remaining 69 was for civic nationalism, then that one can feel one can take comfort from that. But I don't know. I think only the results of the current election will tell. The reason I think we're despondent about this is because we encounter the echoes of the ruling party's rhetoric in society a lot. And you encounter it on social media, particularly on Twitter. You encounter it in social groups and social gatherings, and you are constantly taken aback and surprised by how pervasive it has become. But ultimately we only meet people like ourselves, so we don't really know how widespread or how. So I heard a politician on television the other night saying that, if you visit the villages, people still live together exactly the way they did all this time. This political stuff is only for the elections, it's only in the urban areas. I don't really know. It's hard for me to say, except that I do feel that societally this virus has spread more deeply than it had in past decades, that's all. But ultimately, only the election result will tell. And even if the election result brings about a change, it's hard to say whether these feelings and these sentiments, these anti-minority sentiments, will go away. Impunity might be checked. Vigilantism might be checked. But whether the sentiments go away is something harder to predict. So that's one. As far as the Supreme Court's record of progressive jurisprudence, yes, absolutely. The Indian Supreme Court has had some magnificent moments. Presently, I don't think that this issue has gone up in any form that I can remember in any major recent case gone up to the Supreme Court, except to do with the entry of women into a temple in Kerala, the Sabrimala temple, where the Supreme Court has actually said that women should be allowed to enter against the wishes of the sect that runs that. It's a Hindu temple. And that has led to, a fair amount of the BJP has been hyperventilating about it and has been very upset by it and so on. So other than that, the Supreme Court has taken positions which you could, interpret in, if you look at it through a feminist lens, you might think, this is good for women belonging to the minority community, issues of divorce and so on. But if you are someone sensitive to community rights, minority rights, then you might think this was unnecessary interference. So it's hard to say. It's on one register progressive and on another register interventionist. Hard to say whether that counts, what kind of jurisprudence that would count as in a longer term perspective. Right.
Now, Professor Damani.
Oh, thank you very much, Naraya. In the course of your presentation, you mentioned the decoupling between liberalism and democracy. As you certainly know, Amartya Sen was the first to demonstrate rigorously in a famous paper in 1970 the impossibility of a Pareto liberal, where he proved that there are many situations where the principle of liberty runs at cross purposes with the principle of democracy. And he left the problem there. Nowadays, this issue that you mentioned is resurrecting again, because we like democracy, but we also like liberty, full liberty. So my question to you is, what do you think of the recent attempts in order to cope, to overcome this type of dilemma between two fundamental values of what is called deliberative democracy, in the sense of Habermas in Germany, David Held in England, Manin in France, and many others, etc. Because it seems to me that perhaps nowadays in India, there is a group of scholars in social sciences, political theories, who are trying to adapt, also in view of the fact that Amartya Sen, as you know, in order to demonstrate why nationalistic approach by the present Prime Minister Modi is not effective, he tries to prove that the so-called Western values are not typical and uniquely typical of the Western world, because when he draws from Kautilya, Shastra, Kautilya was a contemporary of Aristotle, he says that even within those roots it's possible to, and so there is no need, what Vittorio mentioned before, purification, because there is no need to purify, since already in the roots of the Indian cultures, those values were present, even though it is true that over time they have been not cancelled, but superseded by other values. What do you think about that?
Very deep and philosophical question. I'm not sure what you're basically. I mean, let me ask you if I've understood you correctly. What you're saying is that in the Indian tradition itself, as Amartya Sen and others have argued, there are practices that can be recovered and ideas that can be recovered, which would be more suitable and relevant for contemporary India than borrowed ideas. I think it's very hard. I think it's hard to live in the present. One can look one can look for ideas in our own traditions which resonate with ideas of the present. But I think to run a modern democracy, deliberative or otherwise, any kind of democracy, I think it would not be enough. Kautilya was not writing about a democracy. It would not be enough to hark back to let me put it this way. One can hark back philosophically to a tradition which resonates with certain ideas of the present. But I don't think it's easy to run popular representative institutions today with ideas from the past. For instance, a little bit of research, and there's almost none, but very little research on the village governments of ancient India, which Gandhi was very, was very taken by and inspired by. But Dr. Ambedkar in the Constituent Assembly actually argued that the local and the parochial is the site of oppression. That is the site of oppression against lower castes particularly. And so the argument that he made was for not recognizing village panchayats, as they are called, in the Constitution. It was only a constitutional amendment in 1992 that brought about that level of decentralization. We now have panchayats at 3 levels below the level of the state. And they are constructed in a relatively modern way. But one could say that they still carry the nomenclature of whatever a few thousand years ago, but they are not the same institutions that they were a few thousand years ago. A few thousand years ago, they would be purely male, upper caste, and patriarchal, in their practices. So today's panchayats are different. It's the same name and ostensibly the same form, but these are popularly elected. They're not village elders and village notables getting together to run the local community. So even with the same idea and the same nomenclature, you can have different practices which are more suitable to the modern world, which are representative institutions, which have women's representation, which have lower caste representation, and so on, which I think is, to my mind, today's panchayats are superior to the panchayats of 5,000 years ago.